Those who are full of years should be full of grace and goodness in their man, renewing more and more as their outer decays. I think that last part's an important part. Those who are full of years should be full of grace and goodness, their inner man, renewing more and more as their outer decays. Some people say youth is wasted on the young, and I think that if it's really done properly, it probably is, because if somebody's that wise in their age, certainly it's a thing that great vigor would probably help to. But I'm sure it's done for a good reason. And finally, well, I'm going to quote two more people. Barclay on this, he mentions the first three, which is sober, grave, and temperate, and says, the three words taken together mean the senior man must have learned what can only be called the gravity of life. A certain amount of recklessness and of unthinkingness might be pardonable in youth, but the years should bring their wisdom. One of the most tragic sights in life is a man who has learned nothing from them. And then finally, Guzik, commenting on patience, he says, patience is the great ancient Greek word hupomone. It means steadfast and active endurance, not a passive waiting. Older men are not just to patiently wait around until they pass to the next world. They are to actively endure the challenges of life, even the challenges of old age. Mike?
Yeah, that's great stuff right there. Let's move on to verse 3. Titus chapter 2, verse 3. Older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good. The first thing that older women are to be is reverent in the way that they live. The word translated reverent occurs only here in the New Testament. The basic idea is that of conduct appropriate to a temple, and suggests that older women are to behave in ways befitting those who are servants of God. Again, we see the part about more mature people leading the rest of the congregation. We've already talked about that some at length, so I'll just sort of leave that aside for the moment. Part of this, I'd like to think, is because older men and women have sort of been there and done that. They've sort of seen it all before, yet we tend to treat them like they don't know what we're going through, I've noticed, at least with me. I've noticed myself saying things like, look, you're old, so I know you aren't privy to these kind of temptations or problems, or you've never experienced this. And when we do that, we tend to miss the point of their experience. It's also interesting to see what Paul recommends the older women not to be. He says, don't be slanderers. Talking behind another's back is just one of those things that some people just can't stop doing. Yet this kind of thing is what you see all the time in church, despite Paul mentioning it explicitly here. Along these lines, it's instructive to note as well that the word here for slanderer is diabolos. This is the word used for devil elsewhere in the New Testament. How important is it not to be a slanderer? Paul uses the same word as devil/Satan for slander. It's the central characteristic of the enemy, you might say, based on just strictly grammatical analysis. Contrasting to that, they're not to be slanderers. They're supposed to teach what is good. I'll just leave it right there. Chris?
Cool. This is also really important because of the importance of women, older women. But first, before I get to that, I just want to mention the first part of what he says, which is the aged women likewise. So the first part of everything that he mentioned for the men can essentially be applied to the women. There's nothing that we just mentioned about how the older men should be that should not also be applied to the women. There are things that
they're not really separate.
Right. Yeah. But there are things that are added to the women that apparently, obviously, are good for the men, but they are specifically to the women. But first, I want to read a quote from Barclay about. It's a little lengthy, but it's recounting a story about a missionary in India who was really illustrates the importance of older women in our society and something that we may have been missing as our culture develops. It says, It is clear that in the early church, a most honored and responsible position was given to the older women. E.F. Brown, who was himself a missionary in India, knew much about Anglo-Indian society in the old days, and he relates a most interesting thing. A friend of his on furlong in England was asked, "What is your most want in India?" His surprising answer was, "Grandmothers." In the old days, there were few older women in the Anglo-Indian society, because those engaged in the administration of the country almost invariably came to the end of their service and returned to Britain while still fairly young. The lack of older women was a serious want. E.F. Brown goes on to say, "Old women play a very important part in society. How large a part one does not realize till one witnesses a social life without which they are almost absent. Kindly grandmothers and sweet charitable old maids are natural advisers of the young of both sexes. The older women to whom the years have brought serenity and sympathy are understanding have a part to play in the life of the church and of the community which is peculiarly their own." Why is it important for the aged to act correctly? One reason is that they are to teach the younger generation, as we're actually going to see explicitly in the next verse, but also they seem to be the stability of the congregation, because they sort of have a natural place in society, in our hearts, to teach. And the things, they know a lot of things, as you're mentioning. They're wise. They've been there before, so they have all this stuff to pass down. And I think, I don't know. I think that we'll just leave it there, but I'll continue. First, then he says, "that they be in behavior that becometh holiness." So basically he's just giving a general rule at first, in effect, that they seek holy lives. But then he mentions not false accusers. Barclay, again, going back to him, says, it is a curious trait of human nature that most people would rather repeat and hear a malicious tale than one to someone's credit. It is no bad resolution to make up our minds to say nothing at all about people if we cannot find anything good to say. Gossip has destroyed more churches probably than any other sin. It's uniquely detestable in a congregation because of its ability to destroy. You would be naive, I would think, to not think that Satan was enticing people to gossip in church, because he knows the power that it can in bringing down a fellowship, especially one that is bearing fruit, and therefore an enemy to his kingdom and goals. A few quick verses. Leviticus 19:16. "Do not go around spreading slander among your people. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. I am the Lord." Proverbs 11:13. "A gossip betrays a confidence, but a trustworthy man keeps a secret." Romans 1:29. "They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips." 1 Timothy 5:13. "Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house, and not only do they become idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things that they ought not to." And finally, Proverbs 18:8. "The words of a gossip are like choice morsels. They go down into a man's innermost parts." And finally, "not given to much wine." And that is, I think, more evidence that this word here, this phrase, does not mean addicted to wine, but rather, as some people will say, that when they see phrases that say not given to wine, they say not addicted to wine. I think that could be true if the real meaning is carries, but I think that given to wine means a heart thing. I think in the case what it's trying to say here is that the older women, older people are not supposed to be given too much wine. That means that they can have wine from time to time, but certainly not be those that are given to it. I think given is a great word, a great translation, as a matter of fact. But anyway, we'll just leave it there.
All right. Let's move on to verse 4. Titus, chapter 2, verse 4. "And so train the young women to love their husbands and children." Okay, so this verse ties in with the previous verse, specifically the last clause of verse 3. They are to teach what is good. Older women are to be examples to the younger. The older ones have the benefit of the experience of living life, and usually of a longer life following the Lord, although that's not always the case, obviously. They are to be examples to the younger women, people to look up to, as both Chris and I have mentioned. It's important to note that the attacks, as Chris also commented, that the attacks of the enemy sometimes come at males and females in different ways, with men being out too late, being drunk, fighting, given to violence. You tend not to see women sort of like given over to violence. Women, at least according to this, and I would agree, had slandering others as sort of a problem to contend with, gossiping, I suppose. Although, they're not separate necessarily. Within this verse, women maybe tended to not love their husbands, to not love their children, which was certainly a cultural thing there on Crete. The gospel was not there to overthrow existing social and societal structures. It was there to replace them with a new ethic. And in this, women were no longer plugged into getting their self-worth from people that surrounded them, but they were to be plugged into the self-worth of Jesus. And when they did this, Jesus would help them love others, and specifically love their husbands, love their children, not slander, as well as obviously the training of the older women to the young women. Chris?
Yeah, that's interesting too. That what they are supposed to teach the younger women here, which is here to be sober, but also interestingly to love their husbands. And I think this is pretty profound. But first, in regards to sober, Vincent Word Studies calls it. It says this verb means to make sane or sober-minded, to recall a person to his senses, hence to moderate or chasten or discipline. Strong's gives it a sound mind or discipline. So to sort of straighten them out, get their head straight, is one of the things that, I guess, to ground them is one of the things that they would teach them in reality, to ground them in reality. But to love their husbands is an interesting one, and I feel like I have an interesting take on this because of just recently getting married and reading a lot of books about it was the interesting thing, because an interesting theme that would come up in a few different books is that love is not something that you feel. It's something that is done, and something that it's a choice that you make every day to love somebody, and to as opposed to sort of a modern cultural idea that if you're not, have the butterflies going, then you've fallen out of love with somebody. But that's only a Hollywood thing. That's actually when real love can begin, and that it's something that it's a decision that you make. So one of the things that I have found, there are a few books out there, namely these are sort of meant for, well, the first one is meant for troubled marriages. One Nancy Missler wrote called Why Should I Be the First to Change? And then a second one called Love and Respect. Both of them have an interesting theme, which is that the one person, and in Nancy's case, the woman actually, in her own, she has a way here that she's shown that her changing her attitude towards her husband actually in effect changed her husband, but she was the one that had to change in that to first submit to the biblical model. But without going into too much detail about the book, the whole thing was about this is that both of them demonstrated that these things were not something that we would normally think of in our cultural mindset. It's almost the direct opposite of what we would think of. But when you look at the values there, it actually makes just perfect sense, and you can see why this is the reason why so many marriages fail, is that there's just a few key things that need to be known. And now we sort of, these books that like Love and Respect or Why Should I Be the First to Change end up being the place of what these older women in the congregation once had, that they needed to be taught how to love their husbands, because it's not something that that kind of love happens very, very easily. So I guess that's that's all that I have for that one.
Okay, good stuff.
The gravity of life. A certain amount of recklessness and of unthinkingness might be pardonable in youth, but the years should bring their wisdom. One of the most tragic sights in life is a man who has learned nothing from them. And then finally, Guzik commenting on patience, saying that great vigor would probably help too. But I'm sure it's done for a good reason. And finally, well, I'm going to quote two more people. Barclay on this, he mentions the first three, which is sober, grave, and temperate, and says, the three words taken together mean the senior man must have learned what can only be called, he says, patience is the great ancient Greek word hupomone. It means steadfast and active endurance, not a passive waiting. Older men are not just to patiently wait around until they pass to the next world. They are to actively endure the challenges of life. Outer decays. Some people say youth is wasted on the young, and I think that if it's really done properly, it probably is, because if somebody's that wise in their age, certainly it's a those who are full of years should be full of grace and goodness in their man, renewing more and more as their outer decays. I think that last part's the important part. Those who are full of years should be full of grace and goodness, their inner man renewing more and more as their outer